Thank you. Sorry, I got that recording in progress line. I want to say hello and thank you to everyone for coming here today. This is going to be a really exciting presentation. We're going to go over economic abuse actions and tactics that abusers use, but we're also going to go over some of the stats from our national study to talk about those actions and tactics, and as well what victims said in our national study as well. And because it was National Housing Day yesterday, we're going to talk a little bit about how economic abuse contributes to housing and homelessness. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And Natalie, if you could let me know if you can see my screen real quick, just 1 second. Yeah, okay, so we're at the right place. This one. Yeah.
All is good.
All is good. Okay, great. I just want to give a quick shout out to Dr. Natalie Snow, who helped prepare this presentation. She was also the lead for the national study. She is currently teaching, but hopefully she can join us a little bit later in the presentation. So just defining economic abuse. Economic abuse means essentially a number of behaviors that either control or exploit or sabotage an individual's economic resources. Essentially, it's any way that an abuser can take to limit an individual's independence and autonomy. And what is the difference between economic and financial abuse? Well, economic abuse includes things like housing, employment, schooling, preventing a person from going to school, but it also includes financial abuse. So economic abuse can be seen as an umbrella term that includes financial abuse. Financial abuse usually only focuses on financial aspects of a victim's life. So stealing money, building up credit in the victim's name, putting the victim in debt, things like that. So the different forms of economic abuse, I hinted at these earlier, consist of economic control, exploitation, and sabotage. And we're going to go into a little bit of detail. So economic control essentially means that an abuser is trying to restrict access over decision-making over a victim's economic resources. So things like withholding your access to a personal or joint account. If the victim doesn't know English or doesn't know the language that's spoken in their country, but the abuser does, refusing to translate or interpret any financial records so that the victim knows what's going on. Denying money for necessities like, childcare, medication, bills, utilities, things like that. Even like lying about the cost of things like rent or groceries, and essentially preventing people from having access to their own money. And on the right side, you'll see a couple of quotes from survivors that we got from our national study and our study in the NCR, so the National Capital Region of Ontario. Pretty heartbreaking stuff. So sometimes he would even want me to go with his mom so he could see that I'm spending the money and not keeping any of it. That's a common story where abusers might even demand receipts when a victim goes out grocery shopping to make sure that she's not keeping any money for herself. And the second one is from a story where an abuser left the relationship. He took all the money from my account and left me with all the debt. Again, a very common story where abusers are knowledgeable about the systems that, like financial or legal systems, and are able to skirt these legal and financial systems so that the victim gets saddled with all of the debt. So some statistics on economic control that we found nationally and also within the NCR. So I'm not going to go over all of the stats, but you can see that in the National Capital Region and nationally, about 80 to 90% of victims said that they suffered from economic control in their relationships. And this includes things like the abuser demanding to know how their money was spent. Experiencing their partner asking for receipts. I hinted to this earlier. They ask for receipts to make sure that, a victim isn't keeping money for herself. their abuser withholding the money that they need for food or clothes or other necessities, having their money hidden away by the perpetrator. Sometimes that happens, or having their money gambled with or shared with other people without the victim's permission themselves. And so you could see in some cases, this was seen even more nationally than it was in the national capital region. So for example, for the first one, we saw 93% of victims' partners demanded to know how their money was spent, whereas nationally it was 98%. So economic exploitation means that an abuser tries to destroy a person's financial or economic resources, right? So that means it could mean physically, so destroying your property or your car or other possessions so that the victim might not be able to sell it to be able to gain the money from it. Straight out, just spending large amounts of money that may be sitting in a joint account. Abusers do this frequently where they exploit memory loss due to maybe mental illness or any traumatic brain injuries or dementia or anything like that to gain their money. Forcing a person to apply for loans or lines of credit under the threat that the abuser would further harm the victim. Sometimes it includes also an abuser taking out credit lines or credit cards or lines of credit in the victim's name without the victim knowing. And then continuing to pursue expensive legal proceedings for divorce or child custody, or lengthening the court processes just to hurt the victim financially. That's a story that we hear frequently. And so again, we heard from some of our survivors and victims on the right-hand side. So I left a stable financial situation, but there's nothing that helps the woman gain the financial situation in the relationship. You're left to negotiate with your abusive partner. I had to move from an apartment that I lived in, even with him, because having a lack of rent, he jeopardized my housing. I was paying rent, but he would just keep taking the money out of my account. So again, some of our stats from both of our studies. And again, you could see that these numbers are within the high 80s to the high 90s of participants showing, so victims showing that they had either their property stolen by the abuser, victims having their perpetrator take away their paychecks, like financial aid checks or tax refunds or any other type of support payments. Around 90% of victims, both in the NCR and nationally, were threatened or physically hurt for paying the bills or buying things that were needed. Some women were forced to ask for money from friends and family, but not allowed to pay them back. This is actually pretty common. The reason that abusers do this is to cut off social connections for the victims. So, like I said, coercive control, economic abuse, they are all means to basically cut off the victim from any other outside sources of support so that the victim is dependent on the abuser. And one of the ways they do this is cutting off their social support as well. So any support that a victim might have with their family or friends, they try to destroy that trust by asking them to borrow money from your family or friends and then saying like, oh, you're not allowed to pay that person back. Obviously, this decreases the trust from the family and friend side in the victim. Other forms of economic exploitation included, again, lending out money to the perpetrator, but then not being paid back. And then having debt built up under the victim's name. Again, very common. And the last one is having the rent or bill money spent by the abuser without their permission. Some other statistics from our national study when it came to economic exploitation. So some of these refer to employment sabotage as well. So around 30% reported that their partners sometimes demand that they quit their job. This actually came from social service providers. So social service providers said that their clients report that X number of clients report the following. And so 33% of social service providers said that their partner often threatened them to make them leave work, report that their paycheck or financial aid aid check is taken from them, that their partner spend the money that's needed for rent or other bills, or build up credit or debt in the victim's name. And again, because it is National Housing Day or National Housing Week this week, I wanted to put a little bit of a focus on how economic abuse affects housing and homelessness. So this was reported by social service providers in our national study. So social service providers were asked to rank how often they find that the clients that they work with report these following concerns. And it ranges from around 30 to 40%, which is fairly high, and in some cases a quarter. But again, some housing concerns were related to being unable to move or leave the partner due to pandemic-related restrictions, being unable to move because of the credit score. This is a common story that we hear from victims as well. When an abuser puts out all of these credit cards in a victim's name, it damages their credit score. And credit score, sadly, is connected to a lot of things that can help a victim gain their independence. One of them is employment, because your employer might check your credit score to see how trustworthy of a person you are. And also landlords and banks will check your credit score if you're trying to rent or buy a house. So around 25% of social service providers said that this was a reason that was reported by their clients, that they were unable to move. Another reason was that they were unable to move is due to lack of employment or underemployment, the lack of emergency shelter space that prevented them from leaving. This increased as well during COVID, because we saw that a lot of shelters during COVID were over capacity. 18% of them expressed concerns about losing their homes, because, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes an abuser would just straight out steal money if they wanted to really put the victim or make the victim dependent on the abuser. And 17% said that they were scared about losing their home as a result. Other ways that abusers demand, or I guess deny access to home, is actually physically denying access to home. So 28% of social service providers said this. 33% said they use restrictions to regain access to a home. 48%, so almost half of them, said that abusers refuse to contribute costs in the household or generate further costs of the household. This includes things like running up utility bills by keeping the tap waters on. This is something that we heard from our survivors, like keeping all the lights on, generating a lot of electricity so that the bills are higher and the victim is unable to pay for them. 38%, again, straight out stealing the victim's money or property. 41% that said that abusers stole the victim's bank account cards or their credit cards, or they withheld money to pay bills or rent or anything like that. And a whopping 42% of the social service providers strongly agreed that their clients often stay in abusive relationships due to the lack of housing accessibility in the area. So this is a really key concern, especially during the pandemic, where housing prices skyrocketed. Because there was a lack of affordable housing, women weren't able to escape their abusers and try to get back on their feet after they had been abused. Moving on to economic sabotage, this means that a perpetrator tries to prevent an individual to gain or maintain work. So this includes like economic, employment, or education sabotage. So things like this include hiding required documents that you might need, like proof of legal status, hiding your CRA documents or your bank account statements, reporting somebody who engages in sex work to law enforcement or immigration authorities when they might be needing some of that money to pay off, again, these bills that the perpetrator is refusing to pay. Destroying your home office or your necessary work equipment when you're staying at home, stalking the individual at their place of work, which is quite common, or requesting that, again, this is another trust inhibiting factor. So requesting that personal connections don't hire the victim when they're looking for employment. Another one that that we heard from an individual, this was quite shocking. We actually heard this example from a literature review where the abuser actually sent really inappropriate material to the victim's place of work, so directly addressed to her boss. They sent them really inappropriate magazines or sex toys and things like that, and got the victim fired. So these are really common tactics that abusers use to try and make the victim dependent on them. Something that came from our studies was a victim who said that even though her abuser wanted her money, he would lock her in her bedroom physically and stay at the door so she couldn't go to work, and then she ended up losing her job. So different employment factors that were impacted by abuse in the NCR and nationally. So 60% in the NCR and 90% of our national study participants experienced their abuser threatening to make them leave work. 87 and 88% experienced some form and frequency of the abuser demanding them to quit their jobs. And then 64% in the NCR and 89% in our national study said that they had either their car keys or some means of transport taken away from them to prevent them from going to work. So the holistic impacts of economic abuse. Economic abuse impacts victims socially, physically, and with their mental health. So historically, economic abuse can impact survivors for 7 years, even after the relationship has ended, due to ongoing issues with debt or your employment or education and your credit. Like I said before, your credit score is connected to everything. So victims will often experience financial stressors after they leave the relationship because their abusers have completely destroyed their credit. Physical health impacts are correlated with economic abuse. There have been correlations seen in other studies with economic abuse, an increased risk of gastrointestinal problems, pelvic problems, and psychosomatic symptoms. And in terms of mental health, economic abuse sees a correlation in increased suicidality, higher rates of psychological distress, and heightened risk of depression. So how do we support our survivors? Our social service providers in our national study said, so 48% of those social service providers said that access to affordable housing should be a primary focus for policymakers. 27% of the social services said that empowerment through financial literacy is of prime importance for survivors and victims. And 12% also said there was a real need for free or affordable employment training. The current supports that social services provide are kind of within a spectrum. So it goes from all the way from advocacy, education, to counseling or legal support. So we had a range of social service providers within our study. So social services that helped victims apply for income assistance or persons with disability assistance, helping guide victims through family courts or legal support. There are some social service providers that had these wraparound supports as well. Providing some educational resources, so awareness about the rights of your financial independence, some workshops on what the cycle of abuse is and the power control wheel, helping clients open bank accounts. This was a small portion of social service providers, but we also heard from social service providers that not all of them are comfortable with walking their clients through these sort of financial accounts and things like that. But some of them did. Some of them do assist with filing tax returns or getting, bus tickets or gift cards or things like that, so that the victim has some financial resources to their name. Some of them also provided counseling support, transitional housing, emergency shelters, and rent assistance programs as well. Things that social services said that we need. So again, this is a range of different things, and it goes back to what I said earlier, where victims need access to financial resources and housing support came out as two of the really big concerns that came out from social service providers, because right now transitional housing, emergency shelters are severely over capacity. And because some transitional housing is within the care of private institutions, the care for them has really deteriorated. So the conditions of these transitional housing is not the way that it was a few years ago when it was under public assistance. Social service providers said that they also need a simplified legal system so that victims can actually go through the legal system without all of these different factors weighing in on them, going through child support, trying to get spousal support, trying to get even their own money back from the abuser can be very daunting, and makes a victim go through a very complicated legal system. Often victims are even discouraged by lawyers from actually pursuing these supports, and they just kind of say, you just need to cut and run, take your losses and start from scratch. So social service providers did say that we sort of need to review the legal system to make it a bit more simplified. Free financial services. This is something that CCFWE supports as well. Having financial debt or credit remediation services, providing free joint account, or sorry, not joint accounts, but free bank accounts or free credit services so that victims don't have to pay to have an account. Little things like that do tend to add up when you don't have much at all. Social service providers also told us that peer support groups are something that are really can be very effective. So matching up women who have successfully left a relationship with women who are in the process of leaving, that's something that was pointed out that could be very helpful, because then victims are able to connect with survivors, with someone who's already gone through the system, and get that empowerment that way. But yeah, I could speak to a little bit more about what is needed. But what I could do right now is pause for any questions.
If anyone would like to ask a question and would like a few moments to speak, you can certainly request to speak, or if you just want to pop it into the Q&A, you can do that as well. I don't see anything right now, so perhaps you can keep going.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to go directly from our report because it has a few more details on the recommendations that we had from our national study. And it puts it more of in a bit of a streamlined way. So just give me 1 second and I will share my screen. Bum, bum, bum. Here we go. Can you see Natalie?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay, fantastic. So on the social services side, we found that there was a real need to create and test a very short, concise screening tool for social services, because right now social service providers, though they know about economic abuse, maybe they might not know the term, but they know what it entails. They kind of don't have like a checklist or a series of questions that they can ask to get this out within the first few meetings with the victim. So CCFWE is right now developing this screening tool, and we're developing a toolkit for social service providers, so it makes it easy for them to walk through the tool with their clients. Social service providers told us that they need economic abuse training and educational resources for victims and staff that they can just easily share with clients. So CCFWE is developing a fact sheet that can be easily shared from the social services side with their clients to walk them through what economic and financial abuse means. more than anything, the development of data collection and more research is needed to understand the nuances of economic abuse. So even though we have conducted this national study and we've conducted the NCR study, we need to have more of a deep dive with what different provinces and territories need for economic abuse clients and victims, because obviously different provinces and territories have their own needs. Like, for example, in the Northwest Territories, there is a bit more of isolation and a lack of support on the social services side. Women can't often, access medical care. You have to drive to get anywhere because there are a lot of more remote and rural communities. So we need a bit more funding to do this research so we can see how we can target these different provinces and territories. Increased funding, a lack of funding, was something that was pointed out in our study for shelters and social service providers to do things like hire more full-time staff. This was a concern that came up where social service providers said that they have to, a lot of them were part-time staff. And what that means is that they sometimes don't get the benefits that full-time staff do, like counseling or training, like economic abuse training or anything like that. That the full-time staff get. So for example, one of our social service providers said that because she's a part-time staff, they don't get counseling the way that the full-time staff do. Full-time staff also get monthly training on different things, and part-time support staff are not able to go into those workshops or go into those training. But shelters and social service providers really rely on these part-time staff to fill in any gaps because, like I said, they're all under capacity due to COVID. Repairing and creating new transitional housing. So I spoke to this a little bit earlier, where transitional housing, emergency shelters are all over capacity. So there needs to be more funding to be able to repair current housing and create new affordable housing. And the last one on the social service side was to create resources, have translation services, and culturally appropriate services for immigrants, newcomers, and refugees. So thankfully, we were able to reach a lot of immigrant and newcomer services who were able to actually provide culturally appropriate services and sort of those wraparound services that newcomers and immigrants might need or might be afraid to leave their abuser for if they feel like they don't have those culturally appropriate services. So this was something that was pointed out as a concern from the social services side. I think I may have forgotten to mention, but we did also survey financial services and financial institutions as well. And so what we heard from financial services was that, again, we need to create and test financial institution training on economic abuse. So we found in our study that less than 30% of financial institution staff actually have had training on domestic economic abuse, which was, I mean, it wasn't surprising, but it was something that definitely needs to be addressed because I think around 60% had training on elder financial abuse, but they hadn't gotten this training on the domestic side, on the intimate partner violence side. But over 60% of them said, I want to have that training. It just doesn't exist yet. So our recommendation is to create and test this kind of training with financial institution staff and create, again, educational resources for financial service staff and clients. Again, CCFWE is working on this. So we are hoping to have financial institution training developed by early next year. And we are working on a fact sheet for financial institution staff to be able to identify what does economic abuse look like within my clients? What are the easy steps that I can take within my own financial institution policies that can help these victims and survivors when I identify it. Again, we need more research that dives deeper into financial institution staff. So if Dr. Snow was here, she would tell you that we didn't have as much of an uptake in financial institutions for these surveys over social service providers. And that could have been because some financial institutions or staff might not think that domestic economic abuse is within their purview. Which I would say is a bit of a myth that we need to address. because many financial institution staff also tell us that they can be the first line of defense for economic abuse victims and survivors. And this is because when people come into a bank or they're talking to their banking advisor, they often go into very personal details about how they spend their money, how their partner spends their money, how their partner prevents them from spending their money. So often before police or social services are involved, we've heard from a national task force that financial institution staff picks up on these red flags, but there is no policy or process within financial institutions that they can flag a particular account under, economic abuse or anything like that, and that they can escalate the situation. So they're desperately asking for that kind of a system. And to be able to help with that, we need to be able to do further research to dive deeper into financial institution staff processes and training. Create specialized programs for victims and survivors, as many of these victims suffer from destroyed credit and they need debt and credit remediation services. We are actually working with a financial insolvency organization to see what we can better do, because it's something that women don't often know when they leave an abusive situation. Some women are told that they need to declare bankruptcy to be able to again start from scratch and start building up their financial resources. This doesn't always have to be the case. I was recently told by I don't know if I can say this, but we've been talking to Bromwich and Smith, which is a financial insolvency organization. And they say rather than going down the route of declaring bankruptcy, which can be pretty detrimental to a victim or a survivor, they can order what's called a consumer protection order. It was just something that before I had talked to this organization, we hadn't really heard about it. So having these like free debt and credit remediation services can be really pivotal to a victim or a survivor that's going through this, because we've heard so many victims and survivors just say, we had to declare bankruptcy. I had a house in my name, but it was also in my partner's name. He was refusing to do anything with it, to sell it, to pay off the bills, or help me pay off the bills for it. And when we separated, essentially your bank, just because you might be in default, said you have to declare bankruptcy because you can't do anything with this property anymore. And then the last thing for financial services that we recommend is prioritize, or at least have a program or a flagging system that can help you identify victims when they come to you, so that you can better help maintain their privacy and confidentiality and security when they're going through an abusive situation. So we've heard from our victims in both of our studies that even though financial institutions have policies to protect privacy or confidentiality, when it comes to joint accounts, financial institutions don't tend to be very good at this, because when it's a domestic situation, they think that they can just hand off that information to the partner and the partner's name is on the account, when actually that can be very detrimental to a victim that's fleeing. So we have heard situations where a victim was fleeing and even went across provinces, and the financial institution gave away the location to the partner because they didn't flag the account for domestic abuse, even though the victim had told him, like, listen, I'm going through the situation, please don't give away any information to the other person on the account. And it was given anyway, unsure why, perhaps notes weren't taken properly on the account or anything like that. But the abuser was able to then find the victim in a different province because the financial institution gave them their address and where they used the ATM last, things like that. And so for policymakers, we noted a lot of systemic barriers for victims and survivors. I've already talked about affordable housing supply and how the increasing housing prices have to be addressed. So one of the prime ways that policymakers can do this is increase regulation on investors or private corporations or multiple landowners, because we found that again, this is something that came up during COVID, that investors tend to use these properties to make money and not really to help people live. So we found a lot of house flippers where a person would buy a house, do not much to it, and then flip it at an increased price. And this really prices out average Canadians that need to be able to access this housing. It made it impossible for a lot of average Canadians, and it makes it sort of a pipe dream for victims or survivors who are trying to just rent or buy a house. Having simplified legal supports and having free legal supports is something that's really crucial. A lot of social service providers said that eligibility criteria has to be revised to be able to get free legal aid, because criteria right now is very narrow. So if you own a property, say again in that situation where I spelled out, where you, like a victim and an abuser, have their name on a particular property, but the abuser is like refusing to sell it, is sabotaging the whole place. Having a property disqualifies you from legal aid. So you're a bit too rich, as social service provider said, to be able to pay, or sorry, to be able to be eligible for legal aid, but you're also just too poor to pay for lawyers. Lawyers cost around $500 per hour to be able to fight on your behalf in courts. And that is simply too much for a lot of victims and survivors. But they just don't have control over the status. So reviewing things like that was something that really stuck out to us from our study. I already pointed to the ease of navigating the legal system, so I'm going to skip over that one. But immigration services was pointed out by social service providers. So when immigrants and newcomers come into the country, social services said that they should be given training or education on what are their financial rights in Canada, because they heard from a lot of their immigrant and newcomer women that they were serving that they had obviously a lot of misconceptions about what their abuser can do, such as like not give them their CRA account, not give them access to that, take away their permanent residency cards, things like that, that victims thought was normal or was something that their abuser could take a hold of. It was something that social service providers had to say, you know what, no, they're not allowed to do this. This wasn't normal behavior. And if they get this kind of training as they land in the country, then that's something that could be really preventative to be able to prevent economic abuse, or when a victim finds out that their abuser is doing this, that they could leave earlier in the process. And again, more research just must be funded to collect data on economic abuse in general. Yeah, I think that's what we had from our national study. So again, I'll just open it up for questions to see if people have any. I see we have 20 participants now. You can use the Q&A function, or just put your question directly into the chat.
I actually have a question for you, Nina.
Yeah, hit me.
Oh, there's one here.
Disaggregate.
Okay. Can you see the questions on your end? All right.
Yeah. So Jane asks, are any of the data disaggregated to show if certain populations or BIPOC folk experience economic abuse at a higher rate? So we do know from other studies that yes, BIPOC women, not to say experience economic abuse at a higher rate, but are definitely impacted harder because they're already marginalized, already very vulnerable. We didn't actually do the correlations just yet for our national study, but I think it's something that we can do now that we have like the final results. So for example, for our national study, I'm just going to go to our demographics for our national study. The victims that we had quite a few racialized women in our national study. For the NCR one, we weren't able to access a lot of racialized women there because it was in the midst of COVID. And we heard from social service providers that these women were particularly impacted by economic abuse. They were just hard to reach. They couldn't leave their abusers at all. So we couldn't get them for the NCR study, but just a moment and I'll be able to show what the demographics look like for our national one. But yes, Jane, we would like to go a little bit further and show what BIPOC women said for their impacts of economic abuse versus white women. Just haven't been able to do that just yet. Thank you for the question, though. Natalie, you said you had a question as well?
Yes, and I think we talked about it yesterday in our Twitter space. Some of you, I don't know if anyone on this call was on our Twitter space yesterday, but there were comments, I believe, that we need, more research, of course, right? In order to really establish some really great, principles, I think, and be able to properly advocate. Where do you feel that there's maybe some gaps in the research, and no fault, obviously, from, the researchers, but where do you find some of the gaps in the research? And the second question, I guess, would be, when can we do a follow-up research on all this?
Yeah, it's a good question. We can do follow-up research when we get more funding. We do have some follow-up exercises from our national study already, and that includes, creating the education materials for social service providers and financial institutions. But we hope that we can do some more follow-up studies next year. We've already applied for a few different funding streams. And the other question that you had was gaps. So I kind of hinted at this earlier, but we need more studies in the financial institution sector. Like I said, we didn't get as much of a response from financial institutions as we did from social service providers. And again, that has a little bit to do with like a slight myth that maybe financial institutions don't, like it's not within their purview to talk about economic abuse or even help these victims or survivors, even though it clearly does. So that's a place where we would love to drill down on, like hear about what their policies and what their systems are right now for flagging, for example, elder financial abuse. They're very comprehensive systems for elder financial abuse that we've seen in financial institutions. And honestly, it could just mean like replicating that for domestic economic abuse survivors and victims. So it'd be really helpful to be able to get more data on the financial institution sector.
Interesting. Thank you for that.
No problem. I'm just gonna I'm just gonna copy and paste from the research, the demographics that we had in the chat if people want to see it, because I ended up finding it. Here we go. You have any other questions for me, Natalie?
I don't see anything else coming in. Let me just, okay, so you pasted that. Okay, well, going once. Are there any other comments, Niha?
I mean, we have a lot of participants in the audience today, so I'm wondering if some people, if they're within the social services or financial institution sector or anything like that, if they could talk, I'm curious to hear about other people's experiences with economic abuse, or what brought them to this webinar. It's just something of interest for me. Anybody willing to share? Will the PDF be shared? So it is on our website, and I can link that just now. Just a moment. There we go. Yeah, and on that website as well, you can see some of our interactive dashboards on the victim survey and the social service provider survey as well. More to come on the dashboards as well. We're just working with our web developer on that. Nobody wants to tell me why they came to the webinar today. Nobody wants to share.
Well, we definitely appreciate the support. Let's see, are there any, oh, there's another.
Is there any way to access yesterday's session? So that session, the Twitter space was recorded. I think Natalie will you be tweeting that out?
Yes, so the recording will be shared on our social media platforms. So check back on Facebook, LinkedIn, and other platforms like Instagram as well.
Awesome. Nonprofit learning about the ways financial abuse can happen and be more aware of the signs. Oh, amazing. Thank you, Zaria, for sharing. We'd love to hear where your financial counselor at, because we'd love to work with you. So if there's anybody in the chat or within the within our attendees who would like to reach out to collaborate or work with us on any, financial or economic abuse things, then please do reach out to me. That is my email in the chat. We'd love to hear from you and work with you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Niha. I'm always learning something new, and I, since this report was published and shared at our summit, certainly we are going to continue hosting these webinars and these types of virtual events leading into 2023. We hope to have at least one monthly lunch and learn. So we hope that you'll join back and, share with your networks. Oh, and we do have one comment here. I joined because I know that economic abuse is a seldom talked about yet prevalent issue faced by survivors of domestic violence in Canada. Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you, everyone. I will be posting this recording as well, and we hope to see you back here after the holidays. We wish you all a very safe holiday, and we'll see you in January. Thank you so much, Niha.
Thank you. Thanks, Natalie. Thank you, everyone.